Welcome to Taxpayer Empowerment. I'm Jose Melendez, Campaign Director for the Taxpayer Protection Project at TPPF. Today we're diving deep into one of the biggest drivers of economic opportunity, housing affordability, and how we can make the dream of homeownership attainable again for working families in Texas and across the country. We're joined by Ed Pinto, Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the AEI Housing Center at the American Enterprise Institute. Ed is one of the nation's leading experts on housing markets, zoning reform, and supply-side affordability policy, and his work has informed policymakers from the local level all the way to Capitol Hill. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jose. My pleasure.
So Ed, let's jump right in. You've said before that the U.S. has a housing supply and affordability crisis due to a shortage of starter homes. From your research at AEI, talk to us about what are the key factors that are driving this shortage and the rapid increase of home prices.
So there are, Jose, two things that are driving this problem. Number one is on the zoning and land use side. Our zoning and land use regulations were designed going back to 1922 when the federal government got involved in this and created the model zoning enabling statute for states to pass. This was not a federal statute or anything. It was just the bully pulpit of the Commerce Department saying, hey, we think you should do this. And what they suggested that they do is create zones of single-family detached homes to the exclusion of everything else. That may sound good or bad or indifferent, but it had a nefarious purpose. Its purpose was to drive up the price of housing. And why did they want to drive up the price of housing? Because they wanted to keep out certain groups, in particular minority groups and ethnic minorities, Catholics, Jews from southern Italy, Catholics, Jews from Russia, Poles. These are the people they did not want to move in, along with blacks from the South and that had moved up to northern industrial cities. And so the way to do it was through economic segregation, because the Supreme Court said it couldn't be done directly by naming the nationality or the race. And so that was passed in 1922, and it worked. It required larger lots, larger homes, and that drove up the price of housing. It also made it very difficult to build the less expensive types of housing, duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, accessory dwelling units. A very common type of home in Massachusetts and throughout New England was the triple-decker, a three-story, three flats stacked on top of each other. And usually a recent immigrant would buy the house. They'd live in the first floor. Maybe they have family members renting the second floor, and they'd rent out to renters the third floor. And that way they would get a toehold on the American dream and build their future. That was all outlawed in 1922. So that's one big piece of the problem, is just by design, how do we make housing more expensive to build and constrict the amount that gets built? The second problem is the federal government, again, is very good at promoting demand, but it's very poor at promoting supply or in encouraging supply. Let's talk about the supply side for a moment. Under our constitutional structure, which is the U.S. Constitution, we have a federal government of defined powers. They're supposed to be only defined powers, specified powers. And we have state governments that have been given some powers under the Constitution, but all powers not granted to the federal government are reserved under the 10th Amendment to the people and to the states. And so land use regulation is one of those powers that the federal government does not have, and therefore resides in the states. And the states themselves then create municipalities, but municipalities are not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. So the federal government has limited ability to work in this area of land use, but it is very good at doing things that drive house prices up. What do I mean by that? Well, the most recent example is a great one, which is the Federal Reserve drove interest rates down during the pandemic to under 3%. That led to a massive increase in home prices. There was a tremendous increase in demand led by very low interest rates. Money was essentially free. And in Texas, this had a huge impact. People moving by the hundreds of thousands from Texas to, from California to Texas, particularly to Austin. This was going on, through much of the country. And house prices went up tremendously during that period. And then the Fed eventually stops that policy, and interest rates more than double. But house prices are still very high. Yet the affordability then is doubly impacted. Not only were the house prices high, but interest rates double, and now housing is very unaffordable. The federal government is responsible for all of that. And they do lots of other things to drive up demand and do nothing to add supply. So that's what's really made housing unaffordable. If we didn't have the federal government driving this demand factor, and if we didn't have local governments whose main job is to stop housing from getting built and to drive up the price of housing, we wouldn't have this problem. And that's why Texas has been historically one of the leaders in affordable housing that's affordable in the United States, with Houston being the most affordable large city in the country, bar none.
So, Ed, for decades, the federal government, in terms of federal housing policy, has focused on subsidies and mortgage access. But you've argued that in the long run, that makes homes less affordable. Can you explain that for a bit, and then touch on why, what would be a more market-based approach at the federal level?
So, great question. And I started my career in 1975 with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, which does affordable housing with a capital A, affordable housing, as we call it, with subsidies. And I'm an attorney by training, and I was an attorney there. And so I know a lot about that topic, having worked in that area for 8 years and worked in the housing finance area and housing area for my entire career, now 51 years. And so when I look at subsidized housing, which again means affordable housing with subsidies, that housing is very expensive. It's only made affordable with massive subsidies. Sure. So let's start with what the problems are with subsidized housing. We call it the 6 C's. The first C is cost. To build a subsidized housing unit of same size and same quality as a public or as a privately built home or unit would cost at least twice as much, in California closer to 3 times as much. So it's not inexpensive housing. In fact, the home builders wrote about this in 1953. They put together a book on this topic, and they said, why is it that home builders can build brand new homes for X, yet public housing costs roughly 2X? This is in 1953. And so this problem is not new. It's been around for a very long time. So you have cost. The second is, why is the cost so high? In part, it's due to complexity. The rules and regulations just for the premier subsidy program called Low-Income Housing Tax Credit runs hundreds, if not thousands of pages. But that's just one set of rules. When you put together these subsidized housing projects, you actually have to get 5, 6, 7, 8 different sources of subsidies, each one of which comes with a rule book. And those rules are not necessarily all consistent. Otherwise, you'd have one rule book. And so you have to comply with all the different rules. And then you have to comply with another series of rules once you get it finished and you're operating it. And that's very complex. Third, you have a lot of corruption. If you just Google low-income housing tax credit corruption, you'll get a whole bunch of cases and stories. Even the public radio, NPR, wrote or had a long series on corruption in Miami with low-income housing tax credit. The fourth is it's a cartel. If you look at the number of developers and builders in the country that even build multifamily housing, there are thousands of them, but only a relatively small number, maybe 50 or 70, build almost all of the subsidized housing. So it's a very small group. That group makes a lot of money. There is an immense amount of money to be made. Given its complexity and the cost of building it, there's a lot of money sloshing around there. And so they can take that money and they use it for lobbying. And so it's a cartel that then lobbies for more money. And so, and they're very successful in that. Whereas the small builders, they don't have the effective lobbying that the large builders have. And they're not making the kinds of money that the subsidized builders are making. So the fourth is a cartel. The fifth is crowding out. There's been studies that have been done, and they generally show that while the government says, oh, we built 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000, whatever it is, low-income housing units, they don't ever quantify how many units didn't get built. because of the crowding out. And I personally tried to build a development about 6 or 7 years ago in Venice, Florida. I got defeated by NIMBYs. I got it rezoned in about 4 months. I was using my own money to put it forward. I had land under control, 30 acres. I had a development team. And I got it through the city and the planning commission. But then the NIMBYs made it clear that it wasn't going to get approved, the rest of the approvals I needed. So then I went to Bradenton, which is also in the Sarasota metro area. And I went to the city, and the city had a couple of parcels that they owned. And I said, okay, I'd like to buy those, one of those parcels to use for a development of maybe 200 housing units. And they said, but Ed, you don't understand. We have LIHTC developers that can pay 3 times what you're paying. I said, well, yeah, but they're getting all that money from the federal government, subsidies and things. They said, we don't care. All we care about is we're selling this land. We want to get top dollar for it. We don't care that they're getting money from the federal government. It's not our money. We're actually going to benefit from all that money sloshing around. So I got crowded out by 2 LIHTC developers, low-income housing tax developers. The last C is centralized. It is very centralized. It's run by the federal government, top down. And what we see, and this is where Texas has excelled, Texas builds a lot of housing, and it's coming up from the bottom. We call it unleashing the swarm. There's a group called Strong Towns. They popularized that term, unleashing the swarm. You want housing that gets built bottom up. That's where capitalism and the free market works. When you have top down, it's centralized planning, and centralized planning never works. And so those are the 6 C's why subsidized housing can't possibly work.
So Ed, you and your team at AEI have worked on what's called an advanced light touch density, or LTD. Can you take a moment to explain to our audience, what do you mean by LTD, and how can this idea expand upon housing supply?
Great question. There's a saying at the Housing Center that no discussion of housing is complete until Ed talks about Palisades Park, New Jersey, where I grew up. And it's about a mile from the George Washington Bridge. It was built in the early 20th century. It was a trolley car suburb. It was pretty well fully developed when I was growing up there in 1950, 1955, 1960. And there were a few vacant lots here and there. It had a small commercial area that was about 10 or 12 blocks long. It was, just the face, the commercial face on each side of Broad Avenue. I lived about a half a block from Broad Avenue, around the corner from the grocery store. And 95%, I wasn't thinking about this at the time, hard to believe, but they were all single-family houses. There were a few two-family houses here and there. There were some garden apartments, and there were a few apartment buildings that had been built in the 1920s, maybe 3, 4, 5-story buildings. And that was it. But it was vastly single-family detached homes. I go back decades later. My sister, lives in the area, as my brother lives in the area, and I'm there, and it looks the same. So this is 8 years ago, 7 years ago. It looks kind of the same. I happen to look at Wikipedia for Palisades Park, and I find that the population's 21,000. Well, wait a minute. When I left, I was always very interested in numbers and demographics. Sure. When I left, it had 12,000 people in 1967 when I went to college. How did it get to 21,000? It looks kind of the same. Families have gotten smaller. Nothing computes here. So it took me a couple of months, and I finally figured out what it was. They had a quirk in their zoning law. They did not follow what the federal government said to do about zones that were restricted solely to single-family detached. They said you could, in 1939, when they passed their first zoning law, you could build 1 or 2 homes on any residential lot. That's largely lay dormant through the 1980s. But this, as I said, was very well located near the George Washington Bridge and at the terminus of the Turnpike, which took you directly to the Lincoln Tunnel, the other main artery into Manhattan. And so all of a sudden, by the late 90s, developers and builders and property owners are saying, wait a minute, I can tear down this house, which is 50 years old, 60 years old, and I can replace it with 2, a higher and better use, because the land has gone up in value. The structure is depreciated, but the land is now worth a lot. And so they started tearing down homes. That continues. So to today, about 60%, this is a town of, as I said, 21,000 now, 60% of the homes today are 2-family, duplex, usually side-by-side duplexes. So that's lesson number 1. that just a slight difference in the zoning code could lead to a lot more housing in what I dubbed light touch density. The second thing that I found was that the next town over didn't have that flexibility. The next town was Leonia, and you actually would go to Oakdean Avenue, which separated the two towns, and on one side you'd have duplexes in Palisades Park because it was legal, and on the other side you had old single-family homes and some what I call McMansions, 4,000 square foot houses that built on a single-family lot. And I said, well, that also tells me that builders will build what's legal, and they will build to a higher density if it's legal because they'll make more money. You'd make more money building a duplex than you would building McMansion. And if you could build 4 townhomes, you'd make more money building 4 townhomes than building the duplex. So that's the second lesson that I took from that. And so I came up with the concept of light touch density. And I also looked back in history and found, wait a minute, before the federal government got involved in this in 1922, light touch density was the norm. Anyone who's been to Ireland and goes to any small town in Ireland, you have the pubs and the little commercial area and the grocery stores and the meat markets, and then you'll have some apartments above those first floor commercial, and then you go and there's some townhomes, and there'll be maybe half a block or a block of townhomes, and then right next to that will be some single family detached homes, or maybe there's a small apartment building. These are in the smallest villages in Ireland. Well, the same was true in the United States. It's true in the older neighborhoods in Austin. It's true in older neighborhoods in Los Angeles. All of that was largely made illegal when they followed the advice of the federal government back in 1922. So what we say is, look, we need to come back to what we had before the federal government advised people to make it illegal. In places like New England, in 1940, something like 30 or 40% of the individuals lived in what we would call light touch density housing today. 2, 3, and 4 units. Common was the triple decker with 3 units. That was very common throughout Massachusetts, all made illegal. Ironically, a place like Cambridge just made triple deckers legal just in the last year or two. They'd been illegal for close to 100 years for no good reason. The reason that they gave was, the housing isn't a good enough quality. I was just in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is right next to Cambridge.
Sure.
And Somerville is just jam-packed with triple deckers. These are the prized housing of Somerville. These were built 125 years ago, and they're still in great condition. And yet these were viewed as slums. They were not qualified to be built anymore. So we're going to outlaw them. They were so short-sighted. That's in large measure what created our problem. We need to fix that, and thankfully Texas is on its way to fixing that.
So you've often highlighted the importance of small and mid-sized builders, folks who used to build these starter homes but were then squeezed out by regulations. What policy changes would make it easier for these small builders to re-enter the market and start increasing the supply of these entry-level homes?
So we've done a study of the entire United States. We've done it at 6,600 different geographies. We've identified 4 different plays in the playbook that one could take. If you took all 4 plays, the way we've analyzed it, you'd get 1.6 million more homes per year, which would be nearly doubling the number of homes that get built a year, over doubling the number of homes that get built a year. We don't need that many homes, but the point is you could get that many homes if you just get out of the way. So what are the 4 plays? And I'll then put it in perspective to your question, Jose. So play number 1 is the smaller lots in new residential subdivisions. Those new residential subdivisions are largely built by larger builders. They're building subdivisions. Small builders generally don't build larger subdivisions. They may build a subdivision with 5 homes, 10 homes, but they're not building a subdivision with 500 homes or 1,000 homes. It's just beyond their scale. But Texas legislature just passed SB 15 specifically about enabling builders, large and small, but mostly they're going to be larger, to build on smaller lots in new residential subdivisions. That's SB 15. But the second thing that you could do, the second play, is to allow lot size and structure flexibility in single-family detached neighborhoods. Houston has been doing that since 1998. Austin passed the home ordinance about 2 years ago, and that was not part of this year's legislative session, but we do know that it has worked tremendously well in Houston over the last 27 years, and it's working well but just starting in Austin. What that does is basically say you can build on a residential lot, a single, like what Palisades Park, you could build. The lot can be as small as 1,400 square feet in the case of Houston. And so instead of having a 6 or 7 or 8,000 square foot lot, you could build 4 townhomes or even 5 townhomes on the same lot. Houston's been doing that. Austin is now doing that. That business is not done by the large builders. That's beyond their, that doesn't fit into their business model. They have a lot of overhead. They have acquisition, they have designers, they have architects, they have all these people on staff, procurement, all of that. Well, the small builders are basically just running their own operation, and they can just go out and buy a couple of lots, tear down a house, build 3 or 4 houses on it, and that's the unleashing of the swarm. That would enable smaller builders and developers to do that. We've done studies in Houston, in Los Angeles, in Seattle, Philadelphia, and other places that show that you literally get thousands of different builders doing this, and none of them, with 1 or 2 rare exceptions, are the largest builders in the country. Option 3 or play 3 is to say you can build residential by right. These are all by right. You can build residential by right in a commercial zoned or light industrial zoned area. Texas, again, just passed SB 840, which in certain counties and certain cities in those counties enables builders and developers to do that. Again, that's going to lean a little bit more towards not the largest single-family subdivision builders, but the larger multifamily builders. They're going to be smaller than the public single-family builders, but they're going to be larger than the very small single-family builders. But it's still going to be a wide diversity of builders. It's going to be much broader than the group of builders that builds the subsidized housing, because these are market rate housing people. And a number of them are going to be townhouse builders, and those, again, are going to be somewhat smaller. And then the last piece of the puzzle that we put together was to have the federal government sell off land that it owns, particularly under the management of the Bureau of Land Management. And we identified under 200 square miles, which is something like 1/10 of 1% of what the Bureau of Land Management manages throughout the country. Unfortunately, none of that land is in Texas. There is some in just across the border in New Mexico, which could help the El Paso area, but there's none that's actually sited in Texas. But there are 10 states out west that this land does appear, and that would be a mix of large developers, single-family subdivision developers, and smaller builders that would build in on these lots that could be onesies, twosies, threesies, at a time, and then larger subdivisions. So what's the key to having those 4 different plays is they each, particularly 1, 2, and 3, each play to a different segment of the development ecosystem. So the first one is the large single-family developers. The second one is the small single-family developers. Those are not the same. And the contractors, the labor, all of those are very different for each. They all have their own groups of people they work with. The third is multifamily developers, which aren't the single family, either small ones or large ones, and the larger townhome, more urban townhome, which again aren't the same ones. And then you have the Bureau of Land Management land, which tends again to be the large single family developers and some of the small ones. And so you get a very diversified group. So if you want to really ignite housing, you want to get all 4 of those areas. In the case of Texas, 3, because it doesn't have any Bureau of Land Management. You want to get all 3 of those areas moving. The good news is that Texas passed SB 15, which energizes or activates option 1. They passed Senate Bill 840, which activates part 3. And they already have what's going on in Texas and Austin. They need it in more places to allow lot splits and lot variability. What's gone on in Texas, in Houston, is tens and tens and tens of thousands of single-family development on small lots, tens and tens and tens of thousands of single-family attached. And in Austin, I think you're going to see some more duplexes and triplexes and quadruplexes along with townhomes. That's what you need. That's the light touch density that you referred to.
Excellent. So, Ed, final question to you. You mentioned Senate Bills 15 and 840. In thinking about those bills, think about, those are huge victories. But next comes implementation. One of the challenges we're seeing here and maybe in other states is that these local governments are not necessarily following through with the implementation part. How do we address that challenge?
It's always a challenge. I think Texas is better suited for that. We know how not to do it, and that's California. California passed in over 50 years ago, I think 60 years ago, passed their regional housing needs assessment. If that bill were working, we wouldn't be talking about California being the most expensive state in the country. They passed their accessory dwelling unit bill, the first effort, 1986. They finally got it straight in 2016. The municipalities fight tooth and nail, and the legislature allows for what's known as too many poison pills. It gives too much flexibility, allows too much flexibility to the localities. The localities, and then the legislature's in a position of what we call whack-a-mole. The game of whack-a-mole, where you're playing that game at the carnival, and then it pops up here, and you whack it there, and it pops up over somewhere else. So the legislature's constantly playing whack-a-mole. And so that's why it takes 30, 40, 50 years, and they're still trying to get it straight. They finally got ADU straight, but they're still trying to get RENER straight, which is a top-down thing. They're trying to get a bunch of other laws, so they're working. They've just passed another passel of laws this past session. They're constantly passing laws. Which ones are actually going to break through the bureaucratic mess is really difficult to figure out. So to Texas, we already know that some cities are embracing what the legislature has said. Other cities are fighting what the legislature did. So they're saying they want to preserve. Someone just mentioned this to me a little while ago. There's something called inclusionary zoning. Mm-hmm. I call inclusionary zoning the ultimate in chutzpah. So what is inclusionary zoning? Well, you own a piece of property. Pre-1922, if you wanted to build apartments on that, duplexes, townhomes, triple-deckers, single-family houses, whatever size lots, you basically could put it together, go in, get your building permits, and start building all very quickly. And then they passed, the federal government said pass these enabling statutes, and then everything got put into single-family detached zones to the exclusion of everything else. So it became exclusionary zoning, and then all the multifamily, including things that were just considered to be the same as single-family, duplexes, accessory dwelling units, small apartment buildings, townhomes, those are all considered sort of the same thing in terms of the size and of the structure. Those all got put into multifamily. And so it became easier to build apartment buildings, large ones, but very difficult to build things like duplexes and triplexes. And also to build townhomes, you had to go through a real gauntlet to do that. And there are many states where very, very few townhomes even today get built. So in Texas, the inclusionary zoning, there are municipalities saying, oh, we need to preserve the ability to have inclusionary zoning, which means a certain percentage of the units have to be subsidized by the developer in terms of lower rents, which means you have to raise the rent or the price for the higher income, and that's the cross subsidy. And so they're saying, well, if we don't restrict the height of buildings to a certain height, we're going to have a difficult time preserving this ability to do exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary zoning, in my opinion, all the research has been done, I've looked at it, there has not been a successful inclusionary zoning program done in the United States, full stop. They always talk about it, but it just isn't successful. What we really need is true inclusionary zoning, which is what we had back in the 1920s, which says, and Tokyo, Japan has true inclusionary zoning, which says you can build all housing of a size and scale that's similar. If you can build a house that has 3,000 or 4,000 square feet, Why can't you build 3 or 4 townhomes that total 3 or 4,000 square feet? Why can't you build a small apartment building? Why can't you build some commercial? And so that's where light touch density comes in. Why can't you have all of these things mixed in to the same neighborhood? And the question that may get asked is, what about property values? We've done a study in Seattle, we've done a study in Charlotte that basically shows that the price of single-family detached homes in single-family detached neighborhoods goes up the exact same as the single-family detached homes in light touch density neighborhoods. There's no difference. And so that, again, these are fictions that people spread in order to try to defeat the approach of having light touch density.
Ed, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your decades of leadership in advancing, policies that promote more home ownership.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Excellent.
Thank you, Jose.
Until next time, I'm Jose Melendez, telling you it's your money, your government, and your voice.